Now sometimes we can use lo and la as well as los and las to act as a pronoun in the second person when we are referring to somebody as usted or ustedes. So instead of saying, a usted or referring to them as usted, we can actually use the third person direct object pronoun. So, for example, lo llevó el taxi. Did the taxi bring you? Notice we're using lo here for did the taxi bring you? This is what I would be asking somebody who I was referring to as usted. Our next section is on indirect object pronouns. Let's ask ourselves, what is an indirect object pronoun? Well, what's a direct object pronoun? A direct object pronoun is a pronoun we can derive from a direct object. A direct object being somebody we could transition to directly from a subject. Dick sees Jane, for example. Jane is a direct object because the verb to see directly transitions into that object. But what's an indirect object? An indirect object does not have that direct transition. So what we have to do is add a preposition to it. In English, we would say something like, I give the letter to the mailman. So in this case, we're using the preposition to. I've got a Christmas gift for you. Right there is an indirect object, an indirect object pronoun because I'm saying you. But in any case, we're using the prepositions to and for. I give the letter to the mailman. Indirect object pronoun. If I wanted to say a sentence with a direct and an indirect object pronoun, we could say I give it to the mailman. And you could see the difference there. We have one object that's directly transitioned to from the subject, it, meaning the letter. And then we also have the indirect object, which is the mailman. However, we have to add a preposition to it because it's indirect. So we need a little bridge for the gap there. Here's the verb chart showing you all of the indirect object pronouns. First person singular, me. Second person singular, te. Third person singular, le. First person plural, nos. Second person plural, os. Third person plural should be lace with an S on the end. It shouldn't be lay. Anyways, you notice though that 4 out of the 6 conjugations are actually the same as every other pronoun, which does help out as you increase in your knowledge in the Spanish language. The important concept to take away from this lesson is the difference between a direct and an indirect object pronoun. Remember, the direct objects can be transitioned to directly from the subject. I see John. I need him. He needs her, etc. If we go to the indirect objects, I send it to him. I want it for me. They need it for themselves. Those are indirect objects. Therefore, when we turn them into pronouns, we have to make them indirect object pronouns. Okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, basically, let me give you some examples. I gave the ball to John. I made this cake for her. Give it to me. Let's further dissect one of those sentences. I give the ball to John. Notice there are 2 objects here. We have the ball and John. John is an indirect object because we're giving it to John. The ball is the direct object because we're actually directly manipulating it. The subject's actually transitioning to the ball directly. It's something usually that you can physically manipulate in a sentence. That's why sometimes it's possible to turn a human into a direct object. For example, I take the client to the airport. The client's the direct object. So let's look at the indirect object John. Now notice there is a 2 in front of the object John. There's a 2 or a 4 before the object if it is indirect, usually. In fact, most of the time. Since we're giving the ball to John and it's an indirect object, we can then form a pronoun out of it. The indirect object pronoun is to him, to him. So we're going to turn this into Spanish. I give the ball to him. Now the indirect object pronoun in English would be to him. In Spanish it would be le, because we're talking about him and that's a third person singular pronoun. So the indirect object pronoun would be to him. So our sentence is going to be le doy la pelota. To him I give the ball. To him I give the ball. Le doy la pelota. You can also say le doy la pelota a él. That actually might be better if the speaker might not know what you're referring to. Remember, context plays a huge key here. So in order to avoid ambiguity, we should add an a John on the end. Or in my case, I actually added an a él if I didn't know exactly who it was. So, le doy la pelota a él, I give the ball to him. Or le doy la pelota a John, I give the ball to John. Les doy el libro a ellos, I give the book to them. I give the book to them. Les doy el libro a ellos. It's important to know that in other forms, it's not necessary to include an a plus a person's name when we're dealing with indirect object pronouns, or direct object pronouns for that matter. But this example, me mandó una carta Juan. Juan sent me a letter. It's not necessary for us to say a me, for example, in this sentence, because the may already takes care of it. Even though you could debate whether or not it's a direct or an indirect object pronoun, whatever it is, it's actually indirect here because he's sending it to us. But you do not need to put an a before the may in this case. Emphasis, however, Spanish speakers will do this a lot. What they'll do is they'll say, me mandó una carta a mí. At the very end, they'll still re-emphasize the indirect object. In this case, it's a mí. And what that means is that the speaker is emphasizing exactly who he sent the card to. For example, me mandó una carta a mí says he or she sent me a letter. Like, how can I can't believe it. How could they send me a letter? So they're trying to emphasize exactly. So let's talk about a special use of the indirect object pronoun. Let's look at the verb gustarle. Gustarle. Spanish does not have a equivalent of like as we have in English. So if we say I like pizza or I like the movies, they don't have that verb in Spanish. So what they do is they use the transitive verb gustar, gustar, to please, and then they slap an indirect object pronoun on top of that. So something is pleasing to someone. Unfortunately, this is one part of public school, the education as far as Spanish language is concerned, that's significantly lacking. So a lot of people can actually be very confused when they first start studying this topic. Let's implement some indirect object pronouns here using gustarle. Me gustan las manzanas. Me gustan las manzanas. I like apples. I like apples. You'll notice that gustar is in the third person plural here, and that's because las manzanas, which is the subject of the sentence, are plural. Remember, we have to look at this from a backwards perspective. What's pleasing to oneself? In this case, las manzanas. Las manzanas are pleasing to me.